one thing you've noticed is that working at Uber, you have no shortage of feedback about failures, because anytime any friend has a failure with an Uber, they're texting me. And I'm like, we have dozens of customer support people for that purpose, but they're going to text me when their Uber doesn't work in France, doesn't work in London. So before I start, I want to get a sense of the audience here today. How many of you run your own business? Wow. And how many of you are involved in a startup in any other way? Cool. So, one more. How many of you haven't heard of Uber? One person. All right, good. So I hope what I talk about today is going to be helpful and relevant to all of you. And if you want to thank me on Twitter, my handle is @waffle. So I'm really excited to talk about failure here today, because we are really committed to confronting failure at Uber. And something our founder likes to say is that we run towards, not away from, tough conversations. And it's really important. It's really fundamental to our culture. And one way he demonstrates this and leads by example is that we have something internally we call T3B3 feedback, which is just top 3 traits and bottom 3 traits where you need to work on. And he shares the feedback he gets from his peers, from his subordinates, publicly with the whole company, so we can hold him accountable, but also so we can learn from what he thinks he's failing at. And we call this feedback system T3B3, and we call the type of feedback fierce feedback. So fierce feedback is being fierce and uncompromising in giving feedback to your colleagues, to your team, and to the company as a whole. And fierce feedback is also about being fierce and brave in receiving the feedback, right? This is really important for all of us. So I'm going to take a moment. I get a lot of fierce feedback from my friends about the experiences they have with Uber, but zooming out as a business, I kind of want to hear if you guys have views on where Uber has failed before I get into talking about the failure. So does anyone want to kick us off? Please. Sorry, OK, it didn't work this morning.
Availability.
Availability is low in certain areas. Go ahead.
Drivers keep canceling.
Drivers keep canceling. OK, what about, let's zoom out and look at it as a business, right? Rather than user experience, although that is an important aspect, yeah.
Your app's not working on all devices.
OK, app doesn't work for all devices. Anything else?
The legal issue.
Legal issues? That's a really good one. Anything else?
Uber versus Lyft at the start in New York and the guerrilla marketing?
Sorry, so guerrilla marketing that Uber engaged in against Lyft in the beginning.
Your challenges in China.
Challenges in China. Great. OK, that's enough. Enough. Very excited audience here. So, what I want to talk about is what ties a lot of those things together, right? The view of how we marketed against competitors in some markets, how we're doing in China, which is actually our fastest growing market and doing very well, how our availability. A lot of these things we see as a major result of us failing to tell our story. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a comms professional that we failed to tell our story, but because our company as a whole, including our business leaders, recognize this. And they talk about it as a B3 for our company. So it's not that a hammer sees everything as a nail, but I just happen to be a comms professional talking about this failure of ours today, right? So I'm going to talk a bit about why I think it's important to know how to tell your story and to tell your story, even if you're not a comms professional. Talk about what happened that led to this failure, what the impact was, and what we're trying to do to fix it, including telling my story here today with you guys. So how did it happen? So one of the major thing, and I think a lot of you might relate to this, is that when startups start, especially tech startups, right, they're founded by engineers, and for Uber, as engineers and operations people. And there's this thing I like to call, this attitude I like to call, get shit done, right? So shipping is so important. Getting the product out is so important. And the laser focus on a product is indeed one of the ways that founders succeed. And it's one of the few ways that founders can really succeed. If they don't have that kind of focus on making sure the product is great, the service is great, they're not going to succeed. But the thing is, you need to do more than just have a good product. And a lot of people believe that making your product great means that everything else will follow, right? The customers are going to come to you, the investors are going to throw cash at you, the media is going to write these glowing reviews of your amazing product. And it's so tempting to believe because we want to believe that excellence will be rewarded, that good and bad are very clear, and it's very clear that your product is good. But that's not the reality. The reality is that there are upsides and downsides to everything. There are opponents and proponents of everything. You're always going to be disrupting somebody out there, and they're going to be opponents. So the fact is that this is a lie. It's a very tempting lie, but it's a lie we can't believe. And it's a lie that I think a lot of startups do believe at the beginning, and I think that a lot of people within Uber believed at the beginning because, well, one, because it's tempting to believe, but two, also because when you start out, things are different. When you start out, well, first of all, no one's paying attention to you when you start out, so you have no one to tell your story to, and you don't feel the need to. So Uber started in mid-2009. Actually, it was founded in March 2009. They ran the first test runs in January 2010. And it wasn't until November or December 2010 when TechCrunch wrote its first article about Uber. So for a long time, it was quiet. And then what happens afterwards is that if your product is good, you start getting good attention. And you're a media darling at the beginning. But the tides will turn. And when the tides turned for us, what we had was a lot of engineers, a lot of operations people, and not a lot else. And those people were not thinking about how to tell our story, let alone getting out there and already telling it to media, to the public, to governments, whoever it was. They weren't out there telling it already. So we were already caught on our back foot. And what happened was that other people were telling our story for us. Whether with good intentions or bad intentions, they weren't telling it the way that we saw it, right? So that's the impact of a failure like this. So how many of you heard about what happened in Paris in relation to Uber? Great. So that's a great example of how, we're also shifting into a very big company, a very global company, and anything that happens in any of our 330 cities now is going to be covered globally. And any one incident in our millions of rides every day is going to be covered globally. So what happened in Paris? Maybe you can tell me.
Basically, taxi strikes and against the whole Uber operation, taking away their business and so on.
Okay, there are taxi strikes in Paris, right? That's not the only thing that's happening in Paris, but it's the only thing that people are aware of. And even though, do you have any connection to Paris?
A little bit.
A little bit, okay. So even people with little connection or no connection to Paris are aware of this globally, right? And people are seeing pictures like this. And that is the perception that starts to build if you let it, right? So what's the impact? We start getting a gap between perception and reality. And if you're going to be cynical, because I'm a company spokesperson, the gap is maybe you could say the gap between external perception and internal perception. And we believe a lot in our internal perception because we have a lot of information about what we're doing and we have a lot of data. But I'm open to hearing you debate that. But so as one example of this, the impact that this has had, I'm going to talk about congestion a little bit. And congestion is an area where a lot of people, think about Uber being a negative, that it's impacting congestion, right? So how many of you think that, ultimately Uber is a negative impact in congestion? All right, that's pretty good. My job is done. I'm just gonna leave now. Well, the New York City mayor did. And he cited the congestion in Manhattan, in New York City, as a reason to put a cap on Uber, right? And this, you might have heard of this. This was a big battle in New York City. Ultimately, Uber prevailed, and we're in talks with the government now about how to address their concerns and how we can provide them with the data to show that we're not adding congestion. But already other people are talking about how, actually that might be wrong. Maybe Uber is not the reason that there's congestion in New York City. And we have a lot of data that shows that too. So 538 Economics did this past week. You can see it's a little bit small, but Manhattan's here. The net growth in pickups has been basically zero, flat, which is green, or very minimal, which is a faded red in Manhattan. It's actually the outer boroughs where they were traditionally underserved by taxis, underserved by other types of transportation, where we're actually seeing that's where the growth in Uber is, right? So we have great data like this, and I'm going to give you some more data points just to hammer the point home. But ultimately, our goal, our mission, as we say it, is transportation as reliable as running water everywhere for everyone. And what does reliable mean? It means that congestion is counter to that, right? Congestion means that transportation is not reliable, and we don't want that. And even if you're, once again, if you're a cynic and you think you're just out there to run your business, forget about the mission, from a business point of view, isn't the user experience for riders and drivers worse when there's more congestion? So that's not in our interests, and we know that. And we can see that actually, if rides are more reliable, that is, if in a city, so this is San Francisco city government doing a survey in 2013, 11% of riders would give up their cars because they don't need it anymore to have that guarantee that they can get somewhere, because they have a guarantee in the form of an app now. And 28% would actually take public transportation more often because maybe they can take an Uber or a different car service to the public transportation stop, or they can take the public transportation out there and then take an Uber home. Whatever the reason, people are actually going to give up the cars and take cars less if rides are more reliable. In Stockholm, Copenhagen Economics did a study that shows that P2P transportation reduces trips in a city that's 10% the size of Hong Kong by 37,000, active cars by 18,000, and because fewer cars need to be parked, because fewer lower car ownership, there's much more room for bike lanes. And the last point I'm going to make is that Uber Pool, where Uber is putting more than one rider that have overlapping journeys in one car, in 1 month alone in 5 cities, saved 4.7 million miles of trips, assuming that all those people would have taken separate cars otherwise. So I'm not just pitching you on Uber, but I'm trying to point out that we have all this information that shows Uber is not a contributor to congestion. It helps congestion, and we really believe that in the company, and we want to fix that problem, right? But what happens when we don't get out there proactively and tell our story? We run into problems like the New York City mayor trying to shut us down in the city, trying to make it impossible for us to achieve the reliability we want because he wants to put a cap on the number of cars, because he believed that we were causing congestion rather than reducing it. And if he had known that we reduce congestion and that, and his goal was to reduce congestion, then we'd be totally fine, right? So telling our story, or rather failing to tell our story, is the cause of a lot of these types of problems. Sorry, you have a question?
So how do you actually measure the metrics of reducing congestion? Like sort of what targets are you setting? Just from the point of view, obviously urbanization is increasing, so is your rate of decreasing congestion in line with the increase in urbanization?
Right. It's very complicated math. In case anyone didn't hear the question, he asked, how do we actually measure, congestion kind of independent of urbanization, independent of other changes in a city? To be honest, I don't have the answer. I'm not that guy in a company. We do have dozens of those guys in a company who I don't really understand sometimes. And again, there are also third parties like Copenhagen Economics doing these studies. But yes, we have to separate it from urbanization. We have to separate it from, and also congestion is, there's this economic principle, right? If you build more roads, actually more people will go on the roads rather than there'll be less congestion, right? So it's a very tricky thing to just measure one variable, but we're just trying to figure out what our impact is best we can. And also, I think once we can roll out Uber Pool in more cities, we can kind of clearly say that if there are 2 people going in the same direction and they're sharing a vehicle, there's no way that we're adding to the congestion on the road, right? So that's something that we're working on. But yeah, we're continuing to try to figure out how to more clearly tell that story and more accurately tell that story. I have one more. 30% of cars in congested downtown traffic are cruising for parking. And that's a great example of how when we can reduce car ownership, when you can know that you can take an Uber instead of driving your own car. It reduces traffic because of parking issues. So how are we fixing it? Well, we hired me. No, but what I mean is that we built a team to fix it, right? So when you see a problem in your company, when you see a problem in your business, you have to make it somebody's job to fix it, right? This is really important. It's not just about having a postmortem, it's about making it someone's job to react to that postmortem. And in this situation, the job happens to be for communications professionals, which a little over a year ago, we had 0 in Asia. And today, we have about a dozen. So you got to make it someone's job. You got to make it multiple people's job. And you got to make it everyone's job. If it's a big enough problem, you got to make it clear, as our leadership team has, that it's everybody's job, GMs, engineers, operations people, to get out there and tell our story proactively to the press, to the public, to governments, to regulators, whoever it is, you got to be out there telling this story, right? And going back to the point of the conference, you got to do a postmortem, right? You got to really think about fiercely within your organization why there's a failure, what happened, what you're blindsided by, and you got to run towards those tough conversations, as we like to do. So that's kind of what we've tried to do with regards to telling our story. And I really hope that helps you guys see that telling your story is critical as you run your business, as you build your business, even if you don't view yourself as a comms person, as a comms expert. If you don't get out there and tell your story, it's going to hit you in the face someday. And if you as founders, you have a vision of yourself being successful. And the moment you start being successful, you're going to get all this attention. And people will already have preconceptions of you, will already be telling your story for you. So you got to do it from day one for your own business, for yourself. That's all.